Zhuge Liang Outsmarts Cao Cao in a river, Showdown. The Yangtze River, wide and sluggish beneath winter fog, carried more than just water in the year 208. It bore the weight of empires. The Han dynasty, once glorious, now crumbling, had splintered into competing warlords. Power no longer flowed from the throne, but from whoever held the largest army, the most cunning advisors, the sharpest swords. At the head of the greatest force in the land stood Cao Cao, Chancellor of the Han, warlord of the north. He had pacified the Yellow River Basin, brought rebellious provinces to heel, and proclaimed himself the sword arm of imperial authority. But it was power, not loyalty, that bound his domain. And now, with more than 800,000 troops under his command, so the rumors said, he turned his eyes south. To the south lay Sun Quan, a young but capable ruler of the Jiangdong region, whose family had held sway over the lower Yangtze for nearly a generation. His forces were smaller, his lands fragmented, but his fleet was unmatched and his generals fiercely loyal. Most importantly, he held something Cao Cao lacked: control of the river. And then there was Liu Bei, a distant relative of the Han emperor and a wandering warlord with more charisma than territory. Chased out of the north by Cao Cao's campaigns, Liu Bei now lingered in the shadows of Jing province. Defeated, humbled, but not broken. He had something Cao Cao feared: the unwavering loyalty of the people. In this maelstrom of ambition, one figure began to rise, not with a sword, but with a fan. Zhuge Liang, a brilliant strategist barely in his 30s, had recently joined Liu Bei. Known as the Sleeping Dragon, he was courted by many, but chose Liu Bei because of a shared vision: to restore the Han, not just rule its ruins. The collision was inevitable. Cao Cao marched south, claiming to bring order, but his aim was total conquest. Sun Quan, cornered between compliance and resistance, stood on the edge of a blade. Liu Bei, retreating downriver, with a handful of loyal men, sought alliance. And Zhuge Liang, newly arrived in the theater of power, would be the key that turned diplomacy into resistance. This is the story of Red Cliffs, or Chibi, one of the most iconic battles in Chinese history. It was a battle not won by brute force, but by deception, foresight, and audacity. It was a turning point that halted northern dominance, preserved southern autonomy, and set the stage for the Three Kingdoms. Yet this was not just a battle of armies. It was a battle of ideas, of trust, betrayal, and survival. A war where the river itself became a weapon, and fire turned the night sky into legend. It began with negotiations. Zhuge Liang was sent to Wu Sun Quan's court as Liu Bei's envoy. Many believed it was a fool's errand. How could a weakened warlord like Liu Bei offer anything useful to the stronger Sun Quan? But Zhuge Liang understood human nature as well as terrain. He didn't argue from weakness. He argued from inevitability. He painted Cao Cao not just as an invader, but as a destroyer of balance. If Sun Quan submitted, he would not be spared. He would be consumed. In court, the debate raged. Some Wu officials urged surrender, believing Cao Cao's army too vast to resist. Others called for war, but feared isolation. Sun Quan, torn between survival and sovereignty, remained silent, until Zhuge Liang's final words: "If you do not rise now, all under heaven will bow to one man. And that man will not be you." Sun Quan drew his sword and slashed through the table. "I choose to fight." And with that, an unlikely alliance was born. Cao Cao was many things: poet, administrator, general. But above all, he was a man who believed in momentum. He had crushed the remnants of the Yellow Turban Rebellion, outmaneuvered rival warlords like Yuan Shao, and swept the north under his banner with stunning speed. Each victory seemed to reinforce a belief. That willpower, when directed with intelligence, was enough to bend the world. The South, he believed, would be no different. But he misunderstood the river. The Yangtze was no simple obstacle. It was a world unto itself. Wide and capricious, bordered by fog-drenched hills and treacherous currents, It was as much a barrier of culture as of geography. The people south of the river had grown up navigating its rhythms, fighting from boats, living by its tides. Northern soldiers, used to horses and dry fields, found it alien and unwieldy. Cao Cao's army, though massive, was composed mostly of northern troops with little naval experience. As they descended into the southern climate, humid, disease-ridden, and foreign, many began to suffer from illness. Horses grew sluggish, soldiers fell to unfamiliar fevers, morale thinned like mist in the morning sun. Still, Cao Cao pressed on, establishing a massive encampment near Wulin and anchoring his fleet along the northern bank. His goal was straightforward: to push downriver, eliminate Liu Bei's fragment of resistance, then crush Sun Quan and bring all of China under his control. He was not wrong to be confident. On paper, his army vastly outnumbered the combined forces of Wu and Shu, but numbers are deceptive in a world of rivers. Opposite him, the newly formed alliance was beginning to solidify. Zhou Yu, the young and brilliant commander of Wu, took charge of the joint fleet. A man of both refinement and ruthlessness, Zhou Yu was no mere provincial general. He understood that this battle would not be won by brute force, but by control of the water, the wind, and the will to strike first. Zhuge Liang, though officially representing Liu Bei, found common ground with Zhou Yu in strategy. Though their personalities clashed, Zhou Yu was proud, Zhuge Liang deliberate. They both recognized the danger of allowing Cao Cao to dictate the rhythm of the war. The key was to disrupt his plans before he could deploy his full strength. Cao Cao, for all his brilliance, made two fatal assumptions. First, he believed that the alliance between Liu Bei and Sun Quan was fragile, temporary, a desperate marriage of convenience. Second, he believed that his land-hardened troops could quickly adapt to naval warfare. Neither would prove true. Zhou Yu's fleet maneuvered carefully along the southern bank, testing Cao Cao's defenses, gathering intelligence, and looking for an opening. Small skirmishes broke out, naval probes and ambushes designed to mask the larger intent. Behind the scenes, both sides began to consider a secret weapon: fire. The river was full of ships, wooden, dry, flammable. The wind, unpredictable in summer, blew strong in the winter from northwest to southeast. If the southern fleet could time a fire attack correctly, it could turn Cao Cao's tightly packed fleet into a floating inferno. But to succeed, the southern commanders needed more than timing. They needed a chance to get close to Cao Cao's ships, close enough to set the blaze and withdraw. And they needed the wind to betray the north, not themselves. Meanwhile, within Cao Cao's ranks, cracks began to form. Some generals voiced doubts about the unfamiliar terrain. Naval discipline was poor. Ships collided in practice maneuvers. Food supplies were stretched thin. And then came the illnesses: dysentery, fever, and rot. Still, Cao Cao laughed. Do they think illness and river mist will break my army? Perhaps not. But wind and fire just might. War is not always decided on the battlefield. Sometimes its shape is carved in whispers, in forged letters, and feigned alliances, in small decisions made in candlelit rooms. In the days before Red Cliffs ignited, this was the war beneath the war, a silent contest of cunning. Zhou Yu understood that brute confrontation would lead to disaster. Though Cao Cao's army was weakened by disease and inexperience, it still vastly outnumbered the Southern coalition. A frontal naval engagement could easily collapse under weight alone. He needed something more. Not just tactics, but sabotage. Cao Cao, for all his arrogance, was not blind. He too anticipated deception, and so he leaned into caution. His fleet, now anchored along the northern bank, remained tightly chained together. An unusual decision, intended to stabilize the ships and reduce seasickness among his army. But this would later prove to be his greatest mistake. Zhou Yu and Zhuge Liang, though technically allies, each worked their own layers of strategy. Zhou Yu, ambitious and loyal to Wu, harbored suspicion toward Liu Bei's rising influence. Zhuge Liang, serene, elusive, sensed this and played the role of guest with subtle brilliance. Together, however uneasy their alliance, they understood one thing. Cao Cao had to be tricked before he could be defeated. It was then that Huang Gai, a grizzled veteran of Wu, stepped forward with a dangerous proposal, a false defection. He would feign betrayal, pretend to defect to Cao Cao, and in doing so, gain access to the northern fleet. Once trusted, he would offer a gift, a convoy of ships laden with supplies. But inside those ships would be firewood, oil, and pitch, a floating inferno aimed straight at the heart of Cao Cao's navy. Zhou Yu agreed. The plan was brilliant, but incredibly risky. To sell the deception, Zhou Yu staged a very public punishment of Huang Gai, lashing him in front of troops for fabricated insubordination. Bruised and bloodied, Huang Gai then sent a secret letter to Cao Cao, expressing bitterness toward Zhou Yu and begging for asylum. Cao Cao received the letter with interest. A seasoned commander like Huang Gai, volunteering to defect? It seemed too convenient. Some advisors warned against it. But Cao Cao's pride whispered louder. He wanted to believe that cracks were forming in the enemy alliance. He wanted to believe that even Zhou Yu's men were losing faith, so he accepted the defection. Huang Gai's plan was in motion. As this theater of deception unfolded, Zhuge Liang turned his gaze to the heavens. He had studied the seasonal winds, tracking the pattern of gusts that dictated naval movement. At that time of year, the wind typically blew from the northwest, favoring Cao Cao. But a shift, brief and rare, could bring an easterly gust strong enough to carry fire ships directly across the water. And Zhuge Liang believed it would come. To ensure readiness, the southern fleet began preparing the fireboats, modifying old vessels with oil-soaked reeds and dry timber, sealing them from the outside to appear ordinary. They waited and waited. Then it came. On a fateful evening, the wind turned. The clouds moved low and fast, sweeping across the water with a dry breath from the southeast. The sails began to flutter, not back, but forward. It was the moment Zhuge Liang had been waiting for. Zhou Yu gave the order. Huang Gai's decoy fleet set out under the guise of defection, drifting silently toward Cao Cao's moored ships. Lanterns swayed in the dark. Crews held their breath, and in their hands, they carried fire. The north had no idea what was coming. The river was quiet, the kind of quiet that holds its breath before a storm. From the decks of Cao Cao's fleet, sailors peered into the night, watching a cluster of ships glide toward them in eerie formation. They bore the markings of Wu, but no sails were raised, no oars stirred. They seemed to float, carried by the wind itself. Huang Gai's letter had arrived earlier that week. Cao Cao, suspicious but intrigued, had chosen to let the strange fleet approach. After all, it was winter. The winds favored the north, and the river, calm and cold, seemed defensible. But then, as the ships neared, the faint flicker of flame danced across their bows. First, just one. Then several. Then all. The vessels suddenly erupted, fire bursting from the decks, flames licking the sails, oil cascading down their sides like molten armor. These were not defectors, these were weapons. Moving infernos, guided not by pilots, but by wind and tide. Cao Cao's men shouted warnings, scrambled for axes, tried to cut the anchor chains, but they were too late. The ships hit like thunder. One by one, the fireboats slammed into the northern fleet, which had been tightly chained together by Cao Cao's own order to prevent seasickness and ensure unity. That decision, once hailed as clever, now became catastrophic. The flames leapt from vessel to vessel with horrifying ease. The river turned into a field of fire, the night sky into a burning canvas. Soldiers screamed, horses panicked, oil stores exploded. Flames spread along the gangplanks, catching on sails, rigging, and the dry wooden hulls. There was no time to organize, no way to retreat. The fleet had become a prison. From the southern bank, the Allied forces of Sun Quan and Liu Bei launched their full offensive. Small, fast warships swept in behind the confusion, boarding isolated vessels, cutting down panicked troops. Arrows blackened the air, while drums thundered from the cliffs. Zhou Yu watched from the deck of his command ship, eyes locked on the blaze. This was his masterpiece, an operation pulled from the pages of history, refined with fire, and executed with nerve. Zhuge Liang, standing beside Liu Bei farther upstream, remained quiet. He had predicted the wind. Now he watched the flame. The smoke rose so high it blotted out the stars. Cao Cao, stunned by the scale of the disaster, was forced to abandon his flagship. He and his remaining officers fled to the shore under cover of darkness, slipping away through the chaos. What had begun as a campaign of conquest had become a desperate retreat. But the nightmare was not over. The retreating army faced new horrors. Fields were scorched, supply lines severed. Many soldiers, weakened by illness and disoriented from the naval disaster, collapsed along the muddy roads. Wu and Shu cavalry pursued them relentlessly, harrying the rear lines, cutting down stragglers. What remained of Cao Cao's once mighty expedition disintegrated into scattered bands of survivors. In less than a day, everything had changed. The river that once seemed to promise unification had swallowed an empire's ambition whole. By dawn, the flames had begun to die. The river hissed as it cooled. Charred hulls drifted aimlessly, some still smoking, others half sunk. Bodies floated in silence. The Northern Fleet, once a symbol of unstoppable momentum, had become a graveyard. On the southern bank, Zhou Yu knelt and gave thanks to the ancestors, not for victory alone, but for the preservation of autonomy, for the chance to resist, for the survival of the South. Zhuge Liang, watching from afar, did not celebrate. He simply nodded, folding his fan slowly. The war was not over, but the tide had turned. Cao Cao was not easily broken. He had survived worse than battles, court conspiracies, political traps, famine, plague. But as he trudged through the muddy paths of the southern countryside, fleeing the charred wreckage of his fleet, even he could not ignore what had just happened. He had gambled everything on red cliffs and lost. The retreat was brutal. The terrain south of the Yangtze was unfamiliar and unforgiving. Mountains pressed close to the riverside roads, thick forests masked ambush points, and rain turned the earth to soup. What remained of Cao Cao's army was disorganized, exhausted, and demoralized. Their provisions had burned with the ships. The horses were sick. Many soldiers had discarded their armor to move faster. They ran not like veterans, but like prey. The pursuing forces under Zhou Yu and Liu Bei did not let up. Cavalry units struck at Cao Cao's rear guard, cutting down supply wagons and scattering his columns. Ambushes harassed his flanks. Though Cao Cao managed to escape with a portion of his officers and guards, the army he had so proudly led across the river was gone. Some estimates suggest he lost more than half of his force, many to drowning, fire, disease, and the long retreat through unforgiving terrain. Worse than the losses, though, was the shattering of Cao Cao's myth. Until now, he had seemed unstoppable, a man who bent fate to his will. Red cliffs shattered that perception. The southern warlords, once viewed as isolated and weak, had humiliated the most powerful warlord in China. The illusion of inevitability that followed Cao Cao like a shadow evaporated in the smoke of his burning ships. In the north, his defeat sent shockwaves. Ambitious governors and regional powers, who had reluctantly aligned themselves with him, now questioned their loyalties. Whispers of rebellion stirred. Unity, once forced by fear, began to crumble. Back in Jiangdong, the victors stood amid the still smoking debris and faced a new reality. The alliance between Sun Quan and Liu Bei had served its purpose, but beneath the surface, mistrust remained. Their objectives had never been identical. Sun Quan sought to protect his family's domain in the south. Liu Bei, driven by personal ambition and his claim to imperial lineage, saw a path toward restoring the Han and claiming his own authority. As the smoke cleared, the land found itself not closer to unity, but on the brink of something far more complex, division into three powers. The seeds of the three kingdoms were now firmly planted. And yet, none of this would have been possible without the work done off the battlefield. Historians have long debated whether Red Cliffs was won on the water or in the weeks before. The fire attack was spectacular, yes, but its success rested on deception, diplomacy, and manipulation. Had Cao Cao ignored Huang Gai's letter, had he better understood the southern climate, had he not chained his ships, things might have turned out very differently. The irony was profound. Cao Cao, the master of cunning, had been outwitted at his own game. As he limped back north, nursing wounds, both real and reputational, he penned verses to console himself, poems of impermanence, of fate and loss. His soldiers had perished not from cowardice, but from overreach. The rivers had not welcomed him. The wind had turned against him, and history had turned with it. But even in defeat, Cao Cao remained dangerous. He returned to Yuchong and began rebuilding immediately. His network of officials remained intact. His control over the north was wounded, but not destroyed. Red Cliffs had broken his momentum, but not his resolve. Still, the south would never be the same. For Sun Quan, Red Cliffs was proof that the river could hold back the north. That southern identity, separate from Han dominance, could be preserved. For Liu Bei, it was a stepping stone. Within months, he would begin carving out a power base of his own in the west, leading to the eventual foundation of Shu Han. And for Zhuge Liang, it was only the beginning. The embers of Red Cliffs still smoldered when the real game began. Victory had not brought peace. It had opened up a vacuum, one that would soon be filled not by unity, but by division. As the river cooled, the ambitions of three men began to harden. Men who had fought on the same map, but not always for the same cause. Now, they would chart their own courses across the fractured remains of empire. First was Zhuge Liang, the strategist behind Liu Bei. Quiet, reserved, and almost mystical in reputation, Zhuge Liang had emerged from obscurity just months before the battle. Born into a scholar's family in the north, he had long watched the warlords fight from afar, waiting for one worthy of his loyalty. When Liu Bei visited his thatched cottage 3 times, begging for counsel, Zhuge Liang finally stepped into the world. His vision was not merely tactical, it was ideological. He did not see China as a battlefield to conquer, but as a realm to restore. In his eyes, the Han dynasty, though crumbling, still carried moral weight. Liu Bei, with his imperial bloodline and reputation for righteousness, represented a last hope for legitimate rule. To Zhuge Liang, Red Cliffs was never about crushing Cao Cao. It was about preserving the balance long enough to build a just alternative. But that alternative required land, legitimacy, and autonomy, which brought him into quiet friction with the second figure, Sun Quan. Sun Quan was young, only in his mid-20s at the time of the battle, but already a ruler hardened by necessity. His older brother, Sun Si, had carved out the kingdom of Wu with blade and blood, and after his sudden death, Sun Quan had inherited both power and burden. Unlike Liu Bei, who clung to idealism, Sun Quan was a realist. He knew that survival required flexibility, and that alliances, while useful, were always temporary. For him, Red Cliffs had been a gamble to preserve his southern stronghold. Now that the northern threat had retreated, the question shifted: what to do with Liu Bei? Sun Quan's advisors urged caution. Liu Bei had no real land base, no revenue, and no secure army. He had borrowed Wu's strength to fight a war he could never win alone. Letting him grow stronger in the aftermath would be a risk. But Liu Bei was not a man to be underestimated. And that brings us to the third figure, Cao Cao. Defeated but not destroyed, Cao Cao returned north to his stronghold in Xuchang and immediately began rebuilding. His control over the imperial court remained intact. He still held the emperor as a puppet. His administrative machinery, so crucial to his rise, remained untouched. And most of all, he retained his greatest weapon, momentum. Even in loss, Cao Cao refused to break. He penned poetry on fate and death, deflecting Red Cliffs as a temporary setback. He issued reforms, replenished his armies, and suppressed internal dissent. He understood that while he had failed to cross the river, he still commanded more territory, more soldiers, and more infrastructure than either of his rivals. But he also understood something else. The war was no longer his alone. By forcing an alliance against himself, Cao Cao had created his worst nightmare, a divided realm where power was no longer centralized, but splintered between three poles. And thus, the shape of the three kingdoms began to emerge, not yet in name, but in action. Zhuge Liang led Liu Bei west toward Yi province, seeking fertile ground to build a proper state. He spoke of a tripartite division of power, a balance that would prevent tyranny. It was not peace, but it was structure. Sun Quan consolidated the south, fortifying the riverbanks, expanding his navy, and preparing for inevitable confrontation, either with Liu Bei or with Cao Cao again. And Cao Cao, watching from afar, plotted his return. None of these men trusted the others fully, but each understood that their fortunes were now permanently entangled. Red Cliffs had not ended the chaos. It had frozen it, divided it, institutionalized it. 3 visions, 3 realms, and 3 men, all shaped by one firestorm on the river. Some battles are remembered for their blood, others for their brilliance. But few live on the way Red Cliffs does, not just as a military turning point, but as a cultural cornerstone. Centuries after the fire faded from the Yangtze's surface, its reflection lingered in China's collective memory, immortalized not by generals, but by poets. Not in history books, but in the folds of operas, paintings, and the ink of scholars seeking meaning in a world so often ruled by force. It began with a name, Chibi, Red Cliffs. Already during the Jin dynasty, just a century after the battle, writers began to reinterpret the event as something larger than war. Lu Ji, a prominent writer, penned poetic lamentations about the transience of glory. But it was in the Song dynasty, nearly 1,000 years later, that Red Cliffs fully entered the realm of legend. The poet Su Shi, also known as Su Dongpo, visited the supposed site of the battle and wrote 2 lyrical essays, the first ode on the Red Cliffs and the second ode on the Red Cliffs. These were not dry historical retellings. They were meditations on fate, impermanence, and the nature of power. In them, Su Shi reflects on how a moment of fiery resistance had become quiet water under drifting clouds. The battlefield was now peaceful, but memory gave it fire again. To Su Shi and his readers, Red Cliffs symbolized more than just military strategy. It stood for the eternal tension between human ambition and cosmic indifference. Here, even great men like Cao Cao could fail. Even overwhelming force could be undone. Even a river, silent and slow, could burn with meaning. And in the arts, Red Cliffs only grew more vivid. Chinese opera transformed the battle into spectacle. Zhou Yu and Zhuge Liang became dramatic archetypes. Proud warrior and cunning sage, locked in rivalry beneath the smoke of war. Huang Gai, the scarred hero. Cao Cao, the overreaching villain. These roles were stylized with color, voice, and gesture. Generations grew up not reading Red Cliffs, but watching it unfold on stage. And then came the romance of the 3 kingdoms. Penned during the 14th century by Luo Guanzhong, this epic novel solidified Red Cliffs not just as a historical moment, but as a narrative climax in a sprawling, semi-fictionalized retelling of the entire era. Here, the battle becomes mythic. Zhuge Liang summons the winds through divine wisdom. Zhou Yu writhes in jealousy. Mai eats. The fire attack is executed with operatic precision. The novel did not aim for accuracy, it aimed for resonance, and resonate it did. To this day, Red Cliffs is taught, recited, staged, animated, and reenacted in Chinese schools, games, films, and literature. Its themes, resistance against overwhelming odds, the triumph of cleverness over force, and the frailty of human ambition, speak across time. Even modern military academies in China and beyond study the tactics involved, seeing in its flames not just destruction, but innovation. What's more, the physical site of the battle, or what is believed to be the site, has become a place of pilgrimage. Tourists flock to the banks of the Yangtze to see the cliffs, to breathe in the mist, to imagine the sky red with fire and smoke. Whether or not the location matches the actual battlefield is almost irrelevant. The spirit lives there, and perhaps that's the real legacy. Because Red Cliffs, in the end, is not just about 208 AD. It's about something universal. The belief that the clever, the courageous, and the united can defy even the greatest odds. That a narrow river, defended by unlikely allies, can become the wall that turns an empire back. It's why Red Cliffs endures, not just as a battle, but as a story. When the smoke finally cleared above the Yangtze, it wasn't just a fleet that had burned. It was the illusion of reunification. Before Red Cliffs, the possibility still lingered that a single strong ruler might once again knit the empire back together. After it, that hope scattered like ash across the water. The battle had redrawn the map of China, not with ink, but with flame. In the north, Cao Cao retained control over the imperial court and the vast, fertile plains of the Yellow River Basin. His defeat was monumental, but not terminal. He still commanded the greatest bureaucracy, the deepest coffers, and the strongest infrastructure. However, his failure to subdue the south marked a permanent fracture in his dream of total domination. He now faced a grim reality. The empire was not his to unify. In the east and south, Sun Quan solidified his base in the lands of Wu. Red Cliffs had earned him more than a military victory. It had secured legitimacy. No longer merely a local warlord riding on the legacy of his brother, Sun Quan emerged as a sovereign ruler in his own right. His domain along the lower Yangtze was economically rich, culturally distinct, and now militarily proven. He began laying the foundation for what would become the state of eastern Wu. Further inland, to the west, Liu Bei began his ascent, not through inheritance, but through momentum. Riding the wave of Red Cliffs, he moved into Jing Province, establishing a foothold that would become the springboard for future expansion into Yi Province, modern-day Sichuan. There, with the guidance of Zhuge Liang, he would construct the third pillar of the triad, Shuhan. Thus, the defeat of a single army created a tripartite balance of power: Cao Cao in the north, Sun Quan in the east, Liu Bei in the west. Each claimed legitimacy. Each amassed armies. Each built states within a state. None would yield. The Han dynasty, already a hollow shell, now became a mere symbol, invoked but ignored. While the emperor still technically ruled under Cao Cao's protection, his words carried no real weight. The center had failed, and from its ruins rose three competing visions for China's future. This division would shape China for the next 6 decades. The Three Kingdoms period, though short in dynastic terms, was one of the most intensely studied, romanticized, and mythologized eras in Chinese history. But beneath the legends lay cold geopolitical calculus. Red Cliffs froze the war in place. None of the three factions would be strong enough to overcome the other two. Every move became a careful game of diplomacy, betrayal, and realpolitik. Trade routes shifted. Naval supremacy became a factor in national defense. The Yangtze transformed from a boundary into a strategic lifeline, an artery that connected and divided with equal power. And while skirmishes continued and alliances shifted, the truth was clear. Red Cliffs had bought the South its survival and given the West its future. Ironically, this fractured balance prevented the very chaos it seemed to unleash. With 3 states locked in mutual opposition, no single faction could descend into tyranny without provoking the wrath of the others. For a time, equilibrium held, not through peace, but through a shared understanding. That victory would come not to the strongest, but to the most patient, the most cunning, the most enduring. And in this new world, commanders became kings, warlords became founders, and Red Cliffs became year one. History tends to carve men into statues. It smooths out their contradictions, polishes their flaws, and sets them in stone as heroes or villains. But the figures who stood at Red Cliffs, those who orchestrated its chaos and endured its consequences, were far more complicated than legend often allows. Take Cao Cao, for example. In popular retellings, particularly those influenced by the romance of the Three Kingdoms, he's cast as the archetypal schemer, intelligent, ruthless, and morally ambiguous. A tyrant cloaked in elegance. But history offers a more nuanced portrait. Cao Cao was a statesman of rare ability, a military innovator, and a poet of genuine depth. His rule brought stability to war-torn northern China, instituted reforms, and attracted some of the most talented minds of his era. And yet, red cliffs haunted him. Though he lived nearly a decade after the battle, he never again attempted a southern campaign on the same scale. Some say it was caution. Others say he recognized something deeper, that ambition alone could not tame geography or the hearts of men raised under a different sky. He died in 220 AD, just as the Three Kingdoms were formally taking shape. His son, Cao Pi, would force the abdication of the Han Emperor and declare the state of Wei, not in defiance of his father's legacy, but as its fulfillment. Then there is Sun Quan, the silent strategist. While often overshadowed by the flamboyance of Zhou Yu or the charisma of Liu Bei, Sun Quan proved to be one of the most enduring rulers of the era. He reigned over eastern Wu for more than 50 years, a span of time unmatched by any of his rivals. Prudent, patient, and pragmatic, Sun Quan navigated shifting alliances and internal strife with remarkable steadiness. But he, too, bore scars from red cliffs. The alliance with Liu Bei, forged in fire, quickly became a political burden. Tensions over territory and ideology soon erupted into armed conflict. And yet, Sun Quan never lost sight of the greater game, survival. While others overreached, he consolidated. While others glorified conquest, he built institutions. When he finally declared himself emperor in 229 AD, it was not as a conqueror, but as a custodian of independence. Liu Bei, by contrast, was the dreamer. His story is that of the righteous underdog, an exile who rose from obscurity, not through inheritance, but through loyalty and vision. His moral code, rooted in Confucian virtue, made him beloved among commoners and elites alike. But that same code made him vulnerable. He trusted too deeply, he mourned too long. When his sworn brother, Guan Yu, was killed by Sun Quan's forces, Liu Bei launched a reckless war of revenge, and lost. Yet in death, he remained iconic. Zhuge Liang, ever faithful, took up his mantle, governing Shu in the name of Liu Bei's young son. For the rest of his life, Zhuge Liang would strive not to expand an empire, but to uphold a promise. His famous northern expeditions were not just campaigns, they were acts of devotion. His legacy became that of the ultimate statesman, wise, restrained, and almost tragically noble. Then there's Zhou Yu, the spark behind the fire. He died young, just 36 years old. But his role at Red Cliffs was irreplaceable. While Romance of the Three Kingdoms often cast him as jealous of Zhuge Liang, history paints a more generous picture. He was elegant, capable, and fiercely loyal to Wu. The fire attack, one of the most brilliant maneuvers in Chinese military history, was as much his triumph as anyone's. But death came quickly and legacy slowly. Zhou Yu became a symbol of the brilliant commander undone by fate, the warrior eclipsed by myth. In many ways, his image was reshaped to elevate others. Yet his presence in the victory at Red Cliffs remains indelible. He did not need immortality to leave his mark. Together, these men did not merely fight a war, they defined an age. And while their kingdoms would eventually crumble, their names would live on, not just in history books, but in the moral imagination of a civilization. Each represented a different path, a different philosophy, a different way to hold power. They were not legends, they were men. And Red Cliffs was the crucible that revealed who they really were. In the annals of military history, few battles resonate like Red Cliffs. Not because of its size, there were larger battles, not because of its duration. Red Cliffs burned hot and fast, but because it was a turning point where everything changed, and yet nothing was resolved. It did not reunify China, It did not bring peace, but it froze a moment in time, one where ambition, geography, and strategy collided in fire, and where the future of a civilization swung on the wind. What makes Red Cliffs so enduring is not just what happened, but what it represents. It's the story of cleverness triumphing over brute strength, of alliances forged in desperation becoming historical pivot points, of the underdog not simply surviving, but reshaping the board entirely. It's the lesson that war is not always won by who has more soldiers, but by who understands the terrain, the politics, the psychology, and the timing. From a strategic perspective, Red Cliffs remains a masterclass. The decision to chain ships together for stability backfired spectacularly. The false defection of Huang Gai, a maneuver requiring not just deception but performance, became a textbook example of psychological warfare. And the use of fire ships, calculated down to the seasonal winds, remains one of the most devastatingly elegant naval tactics ever employed. But beyond the battlefield, Red Cliffs also changed how China understood itself. The battle marked the end of the dream of unification under one strongman, at least for that generation. Instead, it birthed a political pluralism that, while often bloody, forced each of the emerging kingdoms to develop their own systems of governance, economy, and defense. Wu, Wei, and Shu were not just rivals, they were experiments. And their legacies endured in ways far subtler than imperial records reveal. Even today, echoes of Red Cliffs can be felt in Chinese culture, language, and thought. In literature, the battle serves as a metaphor for wisdom over might. In politics, it's cited as a lesson in coalition building. In business, the fire attack is studied as an allegory for seizing narrow windows of opportunity. The story permeates modern novels, historical dramas, even video games. Its imagery burned into the cultural landscape. And perhaps most fascinating is the emotional connection the battle evokes. To scholars, it's a site of endless analysis. To artists, it's a wellspring of inspiration. To everyday people, it's a tale of loyalty, sacrifice, ambition, and betrayal. The drama is so complete, so layered, that it almost reads like myth, yet it happened. Real ships burned, real men died, real consequences followed. Standing on the riverbanks today, at the supposed site of the battle, it's hard not to feel the weight of it. The cliffs are no longer red, the waters no longer aflame. But if you listen carefully, you might imagine the sound of war drums in the distance, sails snapping in the wind, and somewhere beneath the mist, a fleet of fire ships drifting silently into history. Red Cliffs endures because it speaks to something deeper. It reminds us that even the most powerful can fall, that arrogance, when unchecked, breeds ruin, that alliances, even uneasy ones, can change the course of nations, and that sometimes the river itself takes sides. So the next time someone tells you history is written by the victors, remember Red Cliffs. Because this was not a story of victory, it was a story of survival. And survival, it turns out, may be the greatest victory of all.